Hey everybody, welcome back to the Live Ultralight podcast powered by Outdoor Vitals. Today on the episode, we interviewed someone from COROS. COROS, you may know them because we talk about them all the time from their watches that we actually sell inside the Live Ultralight membership, but we also started using them last year and really enjoyed some specific aspects of them, which we do cover in this podcast. But if you're someone who has been considering using one or is on the fence of buying one or actively is using one, wants to learn more about the watches, this podcast is going to be for you. So in this podcast, I interviewed Darian Allberry. He's an ultrarunner and head of user engagement at COROS. So he oversees kind of the press and media communications, but he also is in large part, dealing with like user interface of the product and working with, more of the engineering team to implement some of that. So we get into some pretty unique and interesting aspects of this. But again, I would just say, huge thanks to Darian for coming on. It was a really engaging conversation. In fact, I think we went a little bit over just because I got so in the mix of it, just enjoying all of the information here. But I promise you this. This may sound like I'm overpromising, but I swear a watch can change your life. What I mean by that is more on the health side. I now have everyone in my family wearing watches just to track heart rate and just improve, I guess, like to know how their health is to begin with. But then too, once you start to track that, it will give you a metric to want to improve that. If you've got no idea how you're doing in a category, you can't improve yourself, right? But if you have a baseline, where your fitness is at just by wearing the watch, right? You know where your heart rate's typically getting, or where it's saying that you're lacking, from the apps and stuff that they have associated with these, then you know how to improve it. And I know personally for me, this is when I, shedded another 20 pounds, got in much better physical condition. I've seen that in other people around me. So I love these. I'm a huge proponent of them. There's a ton of additional benefits for backpacking between navigation and just all of that. So stay tuned for this episode. We'll go ahead and roll this interview right now. I promise you guys are going to get a ton out of it. And again, appreciate Darian from COROS coming on. All right, Darian, super excited to have you on the show. Thanks for coming on. We have had requests actually to kind of get into the nitty gritty of watches and what they provide. And, we talk about them really frequently over here at Outdoor Vitals and on the Live Ultralight podcast, obviously. So it's near and dear to our hearts, but we're super excited to have you on the show and would love to just hear a little about your background and how you ended up at COROS.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And thank you very much for having me. I'm excited. It's always fun to be able to actually get out and talk about the things that we're doing beyond just the emails that we're sending and the standard communications. So again, thank you. My background is I started in wearable tech 4 or 5 years ago at Whoop, actually. And so that was my first experience with wearable tech. And then I think I got to a point where I was just so heavily invested in GPS watches because my background is very much trail, ultra, mountain. And I just became obsessed with all of it, both the data, how does it work, and how differently people use them. So when I started with COROS, my primary responsibilities were in alignment with what we'd call user engagement. So how do people interact with the device, seeing if there's ways that they can better use it. And then that was about 3 years ago, and transitioned to today. My responsibilities very much are, I like to try and call myself a product translator, meaning we're taking all the very in-depth information from our engineers and putting that into communications that everyone can understand, and more than just understand, really see the value that they get from it. We're very much a user-centric company in the sense of we build specific products to help people train better. They can go out, explore better, live better lives. And so being able to think about how the product is actually going to help them with one of those two things really changes the way in which we communicate that. And so that's a lot of go to market for our new watches, new software, which I'm sure we'll dig into in a bit because we love talking about software. But that's the bulk of my day-to-day here.
Yeah, I find that super interesting that you started at Whoop and that your job is what it is because I guess in my mind, I kind of classify, because I've used both the Goliath of the space, I guess, or the original. I don't know if it's actually the original. We need to get into this, but like you have Garmin watches, right?
Yeah.
and they've got this kind of stakeholder in here. And then I see you guys as like you guys are like a little bit more laser focused, a little more niche focused on runners and training, and there's some real advantages of that, which I've really enjoyed. So I kind of find it interesting, I guess, that you come from Whoop, because Whoop, I mean, it's like you don't even have a screen on a Whoop band, right? Like it's
Correct.
So it's like almost all just I don't know, like heart rate variability interpretation, or like what, like, so describe, I guess, like what you saw at Whoop that was interesting, or like what you liked about like that Whoop band, and then how you're carrying that, or what the overlap is with COROS.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Whoop is, and I say this a lot about wearable tech in general. Like, there are so many different products that I think serve people better. Some of the first things, if somebody comes up and hypothetically you're working at an expo for a trail marathon or a road marathon, and they say, like, why should I buy a COROS? And it's, well, actually, tell me what your needs are first, because there are people that an Apple Watch will suit better because they like using it for work and they like doing these other things, right? But to go back to the original question about Whoop, I think the thing that Whoop does really well is they communicate very complex information into a condensed manner that's easy to digest, with the 3 pillars: the scores, recovery, strain, sleep. And they have dialed it into a point that I think people really can use it depending on your sport or how you're trying to train, or maybe just be healthier. You can really use it as a health monitor, I think is one of the better ways to describe it, especially in the space of people who are outdoors a lot. I think that's really what purpose it serves to them, is more of a health monitor rather than something that's actually helping you maybe prepare for an adventure. It's going to help you interact with it during, and then kind of what's that post-activity analysis look like? What could I have done better? What does this look like after the fact? And so what translates really well was just the general tech knowledge, right? Because any wearable, I mean, the screen is a big difference from Whoop to COROS, but beyond that, any GPS watch, internal components are different, but at a high level, they're very, very similar. And so building the software, and when I say software, both on the watch, but also the app, and how somebody can interact with that, I think becomes a much bigger question. And like you'd said, we certainly are pretty laser focused on people that want to improve their performance. And that doesn't mean that you need to be Killian or Kipchoge, right? You could very much be trying to run your first 5K or PR a 5K when you haven't run for a while. But how do we help people get better in that manner?
Yeah, I really enjoy that aspect of it. In fact, I would say that for me, it wasn't until I started to use a GPS watch and started to track it that I was able to, I don't know, like actually start to improve my health. And the reason I say that is that for me, I'm pretty goal oriented, and I like to, like, there's a saying, right? A number watched is a number improved, or a number tracked is a number improved. Mm-hmm. And so if you're just going out like willy-nilly and running, say, 5 miles, and then you're like, oh, I should do that a couple times a week, but you're not actually tracking it, you're not actually seeing if you're hitting 5 miles, you're just kind of just going by the seat of your pants, it's really hard to have a number and then to try to improve that number. And so my entire life, I was never a runner, never really tracking miles as much. I'd track them a little bit for backpacking purposes, but that was like when I was already out on the event, right? It wasn't for training. And it wasn't until I started to use the GPS watch, and I'm like, oh, I ran, 5 miles a day and did it in this time. And okay, I wonder if I could like run another 5 and start, and so I really have found that to be hugely valuable for anyone, just like you said, whether you're just barely starting or whether you're, obviously training for a very specific event. But I want to loop back to all of this in a second. I feel like I could easily jump into the tech side of things. I find it very interesting, like what you can learn from heart rate variability and from recovery scores and all this kind of stuff. And then there are, like you say, there are differences in the way that people present those inside of apps and stuff. So, but before we get into the nitty gritty, I guess I do want to also just ask a little bit about COROS and their background. Like I don't know really anything about COROS, and maybe it's because I came into the running scene 3 years ago, and that's really where like their heart and soul is. We're obviously, at Outdoor Vitals more on the backpacking front, but there's so much overlap for training and then also using the product in the field. We had a really good experience last summer. It was our first time using the COROS watches. We used them on the Colorado Trail, and we're just blown away by battery life and some of that, and it really won a lot of the hearts over. So that's after that. That's when we started to retail COROS watches. And anyway, so I guess to come back to it though, I'd love to know the background, the origins of COROS. How long they've been around, how did they get started? I really couldn't find any of that on the website with a quick glance at it. So I'd like to dig into, I guess, some company info if we can, just to get to know the company a little bit more. Kind of their ethos, what you guys are really focused on, because it does seem like you guys are much more laser focused than some of these other brands.
Yeah. So COROS started officially as a company about 8 or 9 years ago. And actually the first product, not a lot of people know this, but the first product that COROS ever released was a cycling helmet. So it was, it was a bike helmet that it had crash detection, Bluetooth bone conduction. And it was just a very difficult space for the company. Obviously, I wasn't here, but talking with people that have been here since the beginning, it was a very difficult space, and decided to make the jump into watches. So the first watch was about 6 years ago. The original Pace was the first watch that COROS ever launched. And it was, I think, the one thing that I've appreciated about COROS a lot, and hopefully people who use the product as well can appreciate, is the product, both, again, hardware and software, our watches are designed around problems that we think we can solve. And one of the main ones that everyone still to this day will note is the battery life, right? And so when the watches started, it was the Pace series, and then got into the Apex and the Verdict series, which are more of your backpacking watches. They're ultra running watches. They're more rugged. They do well in the mountains. And battery life is one of those things that it seems like a point to gloss over, I think, unless you really experience it. And it makes a huge difference. Whether you're doing the Colorado Trail, which is, depending on how slow or fast you go, weeks, that is where it's most apparent, but it's also in the day-to-day life. I think a lot of people don't realize that it is pretty annoying to charge your watch once a day, a couple times a week. You're getting ready for your run. You don't realize that it's dead. So it's a value that is, I think, we don't talk about it as much as I think we probably could, because it is awesome. And it's something that, like I said, when we started with the watches and we knew that battery life was something we could do, one of the main reasons that COROS has such good battery life is not because we're using some crazy battery pack that nobody else has access to, right? It's just that when you're making product decisions on the hardware side, you choose what you want to do. And we choose not to do a lot of what I think people refer to as the bells and whistles, about you're not checking stocks on it, you're not doing anything, you're not playing games on it. And that does allow for a very efficient system with the watch that allows the battery to last as long as it does. And building up to the watches that we have now, the second piece, or the second problem that we saw as an opportunity in the market, was to just be focused on outdoors and performance. And those two things carry a lot of value for people. And whether or not they want to try and do both at the same time, or if you're using it sheerly for exploration purposes, or if you're using it just for the performance side, I think that our app and our watches do a really good job of improving those for people. And those are really, when we think about entering a new sport vertical, so when it was switching from cycling helmets to running, really that was, our focus. And our products do a ton beyond running. I think it's short-sighted to say that, but it's also very apparent that that is what we do best right now, is running. And so as we expand, we're certainly focused on other areas that we'll be excited to get into very soon. But it's, okay, here's the vertical, the sport vertical. What is it? And how do we actually solve problems that people are experiencing there?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's... I can't iterate enough how much battery life matters, right? Even if you are like someone who's not, tracking activity every day, it's, I don't know. I guess people joke about this. Like, I've had people, like, they'll see me take my watch off and they're like, "Oh, your watch comes off? I didn't know it ever came off." Right. And to me, like, it is a part of my body, because I want to track, all of those health, signs, right? I want to track my heart rate every day and through the night, and I want to track my sleep, and I want to know, those details. And So obviously battery life is huge, even if you're not training, because I never think about charging my watch, I mean, for weeks at a time. And then I've got people around me that every single night they're slapping their whatever it is, Apple Watch, on the charger, right? And it's like, to me, I'm like, you're only, you're getting 60% of the value I'm getting out of my watch, because I'm wearing it 100% of the time. You're wearing it 60% of the time, whatever it is. And then it's never dead. I feel like everyone is always like, hey, everyone that I go with on, whether I'm going biking or running, it seems like they're always like, hey, can I add myself to your Strava? Because their watch isn't going to make it through the adventure, right? But so that's like on the daily basis. And then obviously like when you're doing backpacking, multi-day backpacking, we'll still have to charge the watch. But I've had other watches, specifically, my Garmin watch, not make it to the end of the day sometimes. If it doesn't start on a full charge, I'm not always getting to the end of the day. On particular watches, right? Because they're all kind of different. But you mentioned something though that I think is really interesting, which is that you don't have some special battery pack in it, but do you not component wise? And again, we're getting into the weeds here. I wanted to know a little bit more about COROS, the company, but do you not component wise like put a bigger size battery in it than maybe some other people do? Because it is a little bit more of it's a little heavier, I guess, than some of the other watches. At first, like maybe that was noticeable for like one day, and then now I don't think anything about it. But my thought when I first put it on was like, yeah, there must be at least a little bit bigger capacity battery in this thing.
So that's a great question, and one that I wouldn't even have a perfect answer to, only because most companies don't share what they're using externally. So I would know what we use, right? But I'm not going to know what a Garmin or a Suunto uses. Now, it is a good point to illustrate that, speaking about COROS and a focus of ours, and I'm sure the other brands are thinking about this as well, is just that there is certainly room for, as technology advances, you are able to reduce the size of other components, which, yes, allows for a larger battery. So even when I talk about our PACE series, which is very much focused on like runners, swimmers, cyclists, people that want to go fast, just want to have a very light watch on their wrist. That is one thing from the PACE 2 to the PACE 3 that we improved, which was actually just the size of the battery, because the other components got smaller over the course of 2 years. So that allowed for more capacity.
Interesting. So COROS started, 8-9 years ago. 6 years ago, you got into the watch space. How was COROS started? Was there a founder of this thing? Was it an investment company that started it right out of the gate? Are you guys owned by an investment company at this point? Give us just some detail on the business itself.
Yeah, so it's all private equity. So it's a group of investors. And so it started out with cycling, I believe, as not the same group that it is now. And the reason the switch from cycling helmets to watches, which is a pretty big jump, right? Felt, I think, more natural to a couple of the investors, and then more people that were brought on, was that the investors, and I don't have a specific number of how many people, but there were a couple of them that had experience with GPS navigation in cars. So they had been investing in that space for a while, helping out with the actual manufacturing done for these GPS units. And so transferring some knowledge, saying, hey, we know how this works for car display units, whether it was somebody using the old Garmin displays, the actual TomTom type devices, or if they started to get built into cars before airplane phones were across every single car. That was started. As far as the details beyond that, I actually might be a little fuzzy. I could brush up more, but that was the transition from cycling helmets to watches, and why watches was a natural choice. And then, it's a private equity company.
Gotcha. Okay. So let's go over really quick just your watch lineup, and then I kind of want to dive into a little bit of watch selection, but then also getting into how do we pull the most out of the watch, right? And some of those differences and nuances of softwares and things. But lineup wise, I know you have the Pace, you have the Apex, and you have the Vertex. So maybe you've already kind of touched on the Pace, a little bit lighter, a little bit faster, likely a little bit shorter on battery life. Any other differences in that one or any other unique aspects of that one?
Those are the main ones. I think that when we look at our product lineup, and again, the same question of if somebody they're thinking just which one's going to be best for me, I will almost always start someone at the pace until they say they need more. And knowing again what the people listening on your show are most interested in. One of those clear differences going from the pace to the apex would be mapping. So the pace 3 has what you'd call breadcrumb navigation, and breadcrumb navigation, which I didn't learn, I don't think, until a year or two ago, actually was stemmed from the old breadcrumb way to get back, leaving actual breadcrumbs on the trail. So how that works on a watch is different. I think it's a little bit better than the old method, but you're just basically going to see a line on the watch, but you do not see any topo lines. You don't see lakes, roads, streets, anything like that. So going from the pace to the apex, that's a pretty big difference.
Totally.
Then as you go up in size, again, more size for a battery, you're going to have more battery life. Most watches, all of our updated watches now, minus the Apex 2, which is just older than the Pace 3, do have like dual frequency satellite, which is going to be the most accurate. It's the most power consuming, but thinking about hiking the Grand Canyon is the perfect example. If you go down into Phantom Ranch and you are surrounded by thousands of feet of wall, that's an example of when a dual frequency satellite mode would help. It's just a stronger pull on the satellite to get more accurate data. From Pace to Apex, that's going to be the biggest difference. The Apex 2 versus 2 Pro, the main differences are going to be the size of the watch. Again, that leads to battery life, dual frequency being on the Apex 2 Pro. And then from the Apex 2 Pro to the Vertex series, which we just released the Vertex 2S, which is mainly a hardware refresh on the Vertex 2. So it's a new heart rate sensor and then a GPS antenna design. But the difference between those two models, the biggest one is going to be the size of the watch, the display, and the battery life. Again, that's a common theme, but
bigger display on that Vertex.
Yep, correct.
Okay, and then I've known they're sizable watches, but that's also like when I was running with Jeff Peltier in the Moab 240, he was using that watch, and he was like had incredible battery life. Like he switched to that watch specifically for a 240-mile race. I don't know that he had to charge it once during a 240-mile race.
Yeah, no, it's a big difference. The display size, I'd have to look on our site, but I'll be very close. It's 1.4 inch on the Vertex 2 or 2S and about 1.2 or 3 inches on the Apex. So it's not a massive difference. And the other thing I find interesting as well is when you talk about the weight of watches, the Vertex 2 is going to have a wider band. So it is a much bigger watch. And I'm somebody that am sometimes ashamed to admit I have dainty wrists. So I feel bigger watches, but the weight of it specifically, yes, you get very used to it no matter which watch you switch to. And then small things like if the band is thicker, right, the weight's going to feel more dispersed. And then I guess just one last note on the Vertex 2 and 2S is that we also are very much building out climbing related things with these watches. So it you can take the watch bands off and clip it into a carabiner if you're doing crack climbing so that you're not, it's not in the way on your wrist. But those would be, I'd say, the main differences. And then my anecdotal example, not Moab 240, but I have a close friend, Don, who ran Cocodona 250 last year with the Vertex 2, used navigation the whole time. And I think he ended with like 45% battery.
You can find COROS products inside of the Live Ultralight membership. For those of you who don't know what that is a $10 a month membership that $10 instantly loads into store credit. So you don't lose any of the money. It's like a savings account for your money. But inside of there, you can also buy retail items such as COROS watches or water filters or backpacking food, which we have a huge variety of. Or cooking items. So there's a ton in there, but you can save year-round 10% on those items, plus you get a rebate back with everything. So typically that rebate is like another 10% off. But during the month of May, it is what we call our, members are for May or May are for members or something like this, right? And during the month of May, we're going to be offering additional discounts so that you're going to get 20% off of the purchase of any retail products. That would include COROS watches, or water filters or food, plus the rebates back. So you're getting nearly 30% off of products during the month of May. So we're going to try to keep everything in stock. But just so you know, that is going on during the month of May. So if you want to save on a COROS watch, jump over to outdoorvitals.com, get signed up as a member, and save big over there. I want to get into like navigation and some of this. I think those are hugely valuable. So I do want to touch on that specifically for our audience. But what is the battery life? So I have the Apex 2 Pro. I'm about to run a 100-mile race, and I've never had an issue with the battery life. I've also never gone 30 hours in a race. So I'm curious, from what I can tell just off the cuff, and I haven't looked it up, but like that the watch will make it without charging. But what do you say?
Yeah, 30 hours is expected.
That's the goal time. Yeah, I mean 36 is cut off.
It'll be good. Okay. Yeah, there's a lot of nuances, and you can try to articulate them, but there's so many different scenarios on how battery usage is going to affect, or how you use the watch, I should say, is going to affect battery. But you have a pretty good buffer. It's about 75 hours on the 2 Pro, so you should be more than set. And the things that impact battery life most, the obvious one, you're using GPS. That's a very power consuming thing to do. Navigation does add battery consumption. It's not a ton, especially if you're not interacting with the watch every second. And then things like backlight usage, notifications, lap reminders, just the actual vibration and the buzz of the watch. But I think it'll be more than set with the 2 Pro. Yeah,
I'm pretty sure when I did the Colorado Trail, we were hiking, it was probably tracking for 10 hours a day, if not a little longer. And I'm pretty sure I got 3 full days before I was like, I'm not sure I'll make it the 4th day, or it might have been right around 3 to 4 days. So then I charged it that night. So yeah, I mean, that would have been over 30 hours, I would imagine. And I charged it mainly just because I didn't want to potentially die, So one of the guys on our team, he was using hike mode and I was using trail run mode. And I don't know if there's any differences there. And this is when we were using like some watches from you guys where they were shipped out to us and we were just testing them. But he made the whole time without charging once, 5 days of hiking on the Apex 2 Pro. But I didn't know if there was maybe a difference in the hike mode versus trail run mode or something like that. But let's talk about navigation for a second. I think this is especially for our audience, for anyone. In fact, actually this morning I was watching the Cocodona 250, right? I've been watching that. For those of you that don't know, it's a race that's going on. It's a 250-mile race in Arizona, and there's some really big names in it. It's a really interesting race this year for sure. And went to bed, and Joe McConaughey, who's set a bunch of FKTs. We've kind of mentioned him on this podcast as I've talked to a few other FKT guys before. He was leading. I mean, he was crushing it. And in the night, he got turned around and went backwards on the course until he bumped into number 2, Jeff Browning, and had to turn back around and realized he was going backwards on the course. Blew my mind, right? But at the same time, happens. When I was out pacing Jeff on the Moab 240, I felt like my main job was to navigate, especially we were going through miles like 180 to 200 where you're up on the LaSalle Mountains. It's freaking dark. There's no moon out. The trail is very slim, actually quite hard to navigate at times. A lot of the ribbons they'd put up had been knocked down by, I don't even know if they'd been knocked down or if they just weren't there to begin with. But, their claim was that there was a lot of livestock in the area. They knock them down. And I was literally running at times about 40 yards ahead of Jeff, purposely just so I could navigate so that he didn't have to take a wrong turn. And both the guy ahead and behind us messed that up multiple times. In fact, we messed up by about 20 yards. But again, thanks to the watch, I was just constantly, just flipping my wrist over, looking at the navigation, and we went, 20 yards too far of this little offshoot trail. Huge advantage. But the other advantage to this specifically for backpackers, in my opinion, is the lack of having to use your phone. Your phone consumes so much more battery than a watch does. Especially you're booting that up, you're unlocking it, it's loading up an app. You have this way big screen that's way brighter so you can see it. And by not using my phone anymore for navigation when I'm backpacking, it's saved so much battery life, so that because typically you're going on a 5-day backpacking trip, you've got your battery bank, right? And you're like, well, I don't want to carry 2 of these suckers. They're heavy, right? They're just super dense. And so it's allowed me to stretch my phone battery way farther. And then the COROS, its battery life is so good that if I have to charge that watch too, like that watch battery size is a fraction of the size of a phone battery. So navigation has been just absolutely huge. I mean, I even went out I'm running the Bryce Canyon 100, and I went out like last Saturday to do some kind of pre-scouting on a rough section of the course. And dude, I used the navigation the entire time. And I also used the elevation profile. I found that just incredibly valuable to be like, oh, I've got 1,000-foot climb coming right here. I'm descending 1,000 feet. And it was just, I mean, I guess once you have it, it's like you can't live without it type of feeling is how I feel about navigation. So that is a huge benefit to know that the Pace doesn't have the navigation. The Apex 2 Pro does, at least that we're currently selling on our website. So I would absolutely lobby for people to jump to the Apex 2 Pro. Super helpful. Not that you're going to be getting turned around in the middle of the night during a race, but for every day, looking at that, mapping that, keeping your phone just out of sight, out of sound. I mean, I really only pull out my phone when I'm backpacking now to take photos. And so then my battery life is just off the charts compared to what I feel like it used to be. So huge benefit there in the navigation side. And it's really easy. Just to add to this, you basically grab the GPX file on your phone and you just push it to your watch, and you just select it as you're starting up the day, and you've got the map right there. So super easy to do as well. I also was interested in this. I jumped into the course. So I had the Bryce Canyon 100 course on there. I jumped into the course and went like halfway through. And I swear the very first time I ever tried to navigate, it was on a Garmin watch. I didn't mess with the features. I probably in retrospect could have learned a lot more about that watch and used some of that. But I jumped in at like mile 35 and just took off on a certain direction. And the watch didn't like freak out at me, which I really liked, and be like, oh, you need to be here, go in this direction. And so I really also enjoyed that aspect. Now, a question I have about navigation is there a way to put like aid stations or landmarks into the navigation?
Yeah. And I just stop me when I'm rambling, because I have so many fun things, I think, with navigation that are just useful. And they're things that, like, even to this day, I still learn how to use in practice, right? Because for a lot of times for me, I'm reading about what we're doing, and I'm talking to a product manager about why it's being developed, and then I use it in practice one day, and I'm like, wow, that is really helpful. So to answer your question directly, yes, it is possible to put aid stations, checkpoints, viewpoints. It is awesome. I did the Leadville 100 a couple of years ago, and having the distance to the next aid station and the elevation profile. So think, if anyone's familiar, you're leaving Twin Lakes, you're climbing up to Hope Pass. It's like, yeah, it's only 3 miles, but it's 2,200 feet. Like it's going to be a slow go. And so that really does help a ton. And it's not just racing environments, it's general environments where you go, okay, well, it's going to be approximately this much time for me to hike to 2,200 vertical feet. That means that I can probably gauge my water better, my food intake. And one really nice thing about COROS is that you can also do all of this on the app directly. So the third page within the app, you can create routes on it. You can also add the checkpoints there. That doesn't mean that you can't do the GPX file import. So if you find it on AllTrails, if you find it on a race website, you can pull the GPX file into COROS and then send it to the watch, like you said, and it won't interrupt anything. We do have turn by turn as well, which is relatively new and is pretty helpful, especially as you're getting to trail intersections that there's 4 or 5 ways to go, right? It just is one more alert to say, okay, I know that I'm going to go left here, rather than having to sit and look, because the reality of a watch is that it's a much smaller screen. So depending on the scale that you're zoomed into, having a notification of which way you're going is incredibly helpful. And then I think the other navigation notes that I find to be really helpful just in my day-to-day use are the checkpoints, like you mentioned, or aid stations. I use save location a ton on a watch, which I don't think a lot of people might use as much. And the benefit of it is that I can use one example of last summer. I was out hiking around Silverthorne in Colorado, and I was doing this long loop. It was like a 15 or 20 mile loop, and I found a spot that I thought would be great for just like an overnight situation. And so without having to pull out my phone, you save the location just by holding the back button on the toolbox. You press save location. It gives you the GPS, the latitude and longitude coordinates. And then the really cool thing about that is that when you're done with the activity, it will automatically sync back to the COROS app as a location, so that when you go onto the map in the future, you can say, oh, here's that icon that I saved. So then 2 weeks later, I come back and I can just create a route directly to that exact latitude and longitude coordinate that I saved the day or the couple weeks prior.
How did you say you saved that?
Yeah.
Again, so if you're in the, like, if you're actively tracking, so that's one thing is when I'm actively tracking, I don't know, I can't really exit tracking anymore, right? Can I? Unless I like pause the activity?
You can't exit, but you can access the toolbox. And so that is going to be where you're going to be doing a lot of things. So the toolbox is essentially the menu that you go to if you hold the back button, where you get to, or the bottom button, I should say, your navigation, map, compass. That's where you get like an oximeter, which is another point if you're up in the mountains high, I think is a really valuable thing to have. But there should be a pin within the toolbox that is a location. And then you can do save location or look for those you've saved previously around you. And so you can do this during an activity, which is incredibly helpful to me, to be able to actually just save something, because there's a lot of days that I'm not necessarily going out and doing recon, but I'm unintentionally doing it. And I see something that might be good to come back to, whether it's a photo location, if it's a good spot for camping, or water crossings. I do it a lot of times with water crossings because I want to remember where that is.
Yeah. I did not know how to get to that toolbox screen, so I'm literally doing it right now, and I'm very happy that I know that. In fact, I like avoid that button at all costs because it like does the lap, like it does the lap thing. Yeah. So I actually wear this, I flip the screen upside down and put it this direction so that I don't ever hit that lap button on accident. And so I've just, I never touched that one specifically for that. So that's really, really good to know. Can you see messages in that toolbox? I don't see if that's
not directly in that toolbox. The messages are only going, you can enable messages to appear during activities, but you can't view like a list of them unless you're outside the activity.
That's kind of been what I've seen, I guess.
Yep.
Go
ahead.
I was going to ask what Ultra Max is.
So Ultra Max is, we're actually potentially doing away with it. It is reducing the GPS consumption to give you more.
So it doesn't make it more accurate, it makes it less accurate.
It makes it less accurate. It gives you longer battery life. But what it does is it does reduce the amount of times that the watch is communicating with satellite. And I think that it's one of those things where when it was initially available, we saw good value, but generally speaking, our products have gained battery life, so it's not as much of an issue. And I think it sets the wrong precedent sometimes, that people just don't get the accuracy they expected.
All right. So one other thing I just got to call out here inside of that toolbox. So as you're doing an activity, you can navigate to oximeter. And so a lot of people are hiking to high altitudes and you may feel like you're getting altitude sick. So just so you are aware, you could check your blood oxygen levels during an activity now if you wanted to, which I find very valuable. So that's really, really cool. And then, just a lot of nice settings. I like this. I actually use your COROS armband heart rate monitor.
Yeah.
I've dabbled with it a little bit. And there's been times when I've started an activity and I haven't been connected. So nice to know that I can connect that in an activity now.
Yeah.
No, this is super nice. Cool. That's okay.
One last note on navigation that I also find really helpful that people may not know offhand, whether it's us or even people using Garmin watches, that I'm not positive on Garmin. I know that there's one thing you can do on COROS and Garmin, which is back to start, which is an incredibly helpful feature, which is, say you start without using navigation, you think you get turned around, you don't really know where you are. Same thing during an activity. If you go to the toolbox, hold the bottom button, go to navigation, there will just be an option that's back to start. And it's just going to route you the exact same way that you came to get back to wherever you started, which is really helpful. And then I do this one a lot because I'm probably overly confident in my knowledge of trail systems around me, where I will start not using navigation and then I will realize that I'm not where I am, but I know that there's like a good loop that I want to piece together. I don't just want to turn around. And so during an activity, you can actually pull out your phone, finish the route in the COROS app, and send it to the watch during the activity. It will transfer the remainder of the route. So I did it actually this weekend. So syncing new routes or finding a new destination during an activity as well is something that I find helpful.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. I would say just again that yes, it is a smaller screen for navigation. My experience with most of you probably listening is that you can't read a map anyways. So or at least to a high level. And so honestly, between that elevation profile and just having the map on there, it's quicker and easier to digest than trying to get out a topo map and really like figure it out. Because some people see those topo maps and they just lose their mind. They're like, oh, I have no idea what's going on, right? So I do like that. One thing that I love about your watches and the interface itself is the ability to get on your phone and customize the screens. So it drove me nuts on some other watches that I had. They had a smaller display, and I'm kind of comparing just two different watches. I had an Instinct 2 Solar, had a couple Instincts, and it doesn't have the same screen size and ability, right? But it drove me nuts that I would toggle between like 4 to 5 screens to get all the info that I wanted. And so when I got this, and it was like, I found this screen that has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, I think 8 data fields that I could fill in. So on one like screen, I can see just a tremendous amount of info. I loved that. I went in, I customized it, and I'm like, now realistically, I can stay on one screen 99% of the time and know everything I want. And then I built another screen where it's like, if I just want to know everything about the elevation right now, I go to that and it gives me gain and loss, percentage of climbing or descending, and like my current altitude. And so that's like my elevation screen. But everything else that I need is really on that other screen. And it's just huge. I guess on the other screen too, like one screen, it's like time of how long I've been doing the activity. And the other, I keep like what the time of day is and how much percentage of battery it has. And so between two screens, I get everything. Whereas it used to feel like I was on 5 screens. So I did want to call that out as a user interface aspect that I personally really, really enjoy. And setting that up on the phone is incredibly easy. And then I have actually switched between a few watches. You literally load up the new watch and you just like select your profile and everything imports in, and it's crazy, crazy fast and efficient. So you never have to reset everything and rebuild a watch, I guess you have to say, like all the settings. So I do love that about the lineup as well.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about, let's see, I'm just kind of looking at some of the questions from listeners. A lot of it was around navigation and battery life. No surprise there. But let's talk a little bit about, okay, I want to talk about this one. I have a lot of praises for COROS watches. I use them all the time. I have at times had some issues with elevation tracking. Lately, it's been over tracking. And so I'm curious because it seems like the issue was probably due to the barometric pressure like sensor maybe got dirty or something got in there. I'm not sure. But the base of this question is why are people using barometric pressure for altitude versus just GPS? Like you're already pinging the GPS and you can get altitude from GPS location. So what is the reason that they're using barometric pressure instead of GPS?
Yeah, so in activity, the reason that you're going to use barometric pressure is because it's more responsive. So you're going to be able to see the fluctuations a lot quicker. There's going to be a very standard delay, I guess is what you'd call it, with GPS. So especially when you get up into higher altitudes, I think it matters quite a bit. Or if you're somebody that's moving fast, again, right? Like 30 meters on a road that you're trying to run pretty fast, or if you're 30 meters on a mountain and you're up pretty high is significant. And that gap could be very delayed if you were using GPS. Now, barometers are by no means perfect. I think everybody finds that out at one time or another when they really start to pay attention to the data. There are a handful of things that impact them, weather patterns. So if it's a storm rolling in or something, right, the pressure drops, that can impact a barometer. That's actually something that both Garmin and COROS watches have as well on more of the adventure focused watches, is like a storm alert. So if pressure is dropping really quickly, it'll actually alert you of that. And the other thing with a barometer in general, and our newer watches, I think we've gotten better at, because it also, how the barometer functions at a very base level. I think you kind of explained it, right? But it's measuring air pressure to detect if you're going up or down. And another thing that is going to impact that is, number one, where's the sensor placed on the watch? And the reason that that's important is because wind can actually affect a barometer pretty heavily, depending how windy it is and where the watch is worn. So I wear my watch skiing a lot. And a lot of times when you get up on a ridge, if you're touring or just even at a resort, if it's really windy, you'll notice the fluctuations on the barometer. Again, not necessarily COROS specific, any watch. And then it's kind of funny that if you just put it under a sleeve when you're skiing, you usually don't see those near as much, because it's going to be much more evened out. Now, I think the second piece to that is going more. There's a few settings that you can play with on any GPS watch to try and make the barometer more accurate. You can use what you'd call sea level pressure versus station level pressure. And those can impact the way in which it's essentially sourcing the data that you're going to be using for the activity. And it's not going to necessarily impact, let's say, miles 1 to 4 as much as it will impact the start point of like what's your elevation at this moment. And then I think the second piece of that is also whether or not the barometer data versus GPS is used in the app, right? When you're viewing it after the fact rather than in the activity. I think until there's a better, maybe more responsive solution, barometers will be around for a bit to track during an activity. In the app, that's a tricky one at times, because GPS is 95, 98% of the time great on the total elevation. But in extreme instances that you could point out, there's times when GPS data can actually be really bad for elevation. So right now we do use the barometer measured elevation in the app. There are ways that you can correct it. If you use Strava, you can always go in and course correct the elevation in the Strava profile. Toyed with that idea about offering that option in the app, but the example of why we still choose to use barometer right now for the elevation in the app, and again, it's an extreme example. I think most cases you'd be totally fine, but the Golden Gate Bridge, right? If you're going over the Golden Gate Bridge, your watch barometer is going to know that you're slowly going up and you're over the water and then you're coming down. If you only use GPS data, it's going to think that you're on the water. So there's actually, you can see this sometimes if somebody switches to GPS data on an instance like that for whatever reason, it's in relative scope from a satellite. It's a very, very small thing on the Earth that is missed. And so it thinks that you're hitting the ocean, and it's going to give you really bad data. So it's a trade-off for sure. Strava has a good solution to that, just because they have user data from thousands and thousands and thousands of people to use averages about, like, if, again, using Golden Gate Bridge as an example, there's thousands of rides and runs across that, right, in any given year. They can use the average to kind of even everything out so that it does take a little bit of that miscalculation that a barometer might have out of play, just to show a more consistent number.
So you were saying that you can course correct. So if somehow, let's say your barometer got messed with, right? Mm-hmm. Is there a way in the COROS app to adjust that, or use the GPS altitude, did you say?
Not right now. We've toyed with it. We've had it in beta versions where we'll actually use Google Maps to adjust it or correct it based on GPS. That may be something that we do in the future. It's It's actually one that I'm holding the flag for. I like the idea of it. We do try to keep the product simple. It might confuse people, but I do see the value. You can do it on Strava right now. If you go to, I believe it's edit activity, or maybe it's crop activity, or adjust
Yeah,
elevation.
I just did that for the first time, which I'm actually, I mean, that's total side note, but I'm really glad you added that because I've had to deal with that until this week. Actually, I tried to like clean that sensor, and I have no idea if I did that right. But I mean, because I think I don't know. I'm a crazy salty sweater, but I also like have gone to like the sand dunes recently, and I'm like maybe a piece of sand got in there, but it started just kicking out crazy numbers, and I was like, oh man, this isn't. I can't use this at the current moment. So I think I've got it back under control, but that is nice that you can course correct that in Strava. Okay, this is something I've wanted to ask for a while. But it goes two parts to it, I guess. It's just a direct comparison to Garmin. And this may not be a fair question because there's so many models, but so first off, I guess to continue on the elevation side, does Garmin also use barometric pressure for their altitude or elevation changes? Okay, so there's no difference there. And then talk to me about heart rate. In fact, I got really frustrated with Garmin and my heart rate being like, man, my heart rate is racing and it says it's this, or my heart rate is not racing and it says it's this. And I'm like, maybe the COROS would be more accurate. Came over to the COROS. I felt like it was accurate, but then there'll just be times when it won't be. And I'm like, man, like I feel like my watch is on tight. I feel like it's in a good spot. Like what's going on here? I know there's movement and you're like, you have this tiny heart rate monitor on the end of an arm that's swinging around, right? So tell me, I guess, how often it's pulling heart rate vitals and updating that. How often can you see a change? Are there things to be aware of to help the watch? You know what I mean? Whether maybe that's position on the arm, maybe that's tightness of the band. Just, I'm really interested in trying to do that because one of the things I've thought about for this 100-mile race was like to start the race with the armband on to make sure that I use it as kind of like a rev limiter per se. Be like, all right, I'm going to keep my heart rate under 140 at all times during the first 20 miles of this, and then maybe I'll take it off and not use it. But so heart rate accuracy, tell us how COROS does it, how it's better, all that.
Yeah, heart rate's a fun one. It's because I think to understand wearable heart rate data, there's like a prerequisite set of information I think that's always helpful that I find myself talking about a lot. And the number one thing is that it's gotten a lot better than where it used to be like 10 years ago. And that's across all brands. Heart rate on the wrist is a lot better. Now, if you actually look at studies and research, while the wrist is the most convenient place to measure heart rate, because that's where you put a wearable, it is one of the worst places on the body to measure heart rate. Like as a hilarious example, your earlobe is a better spot to measure heart rate than your wrist. And it's because of what you mentioned. It's because of all the movement, right? Yeah. So there's two things that I think you can point to when you talk about the limitations of, there's a few, but when you talk about the limitations of a wrist-based heart rate and things that you can do to try to improve it, the first one is really just anatomy, right? It's that in your arm, especially if you are hiking, let's say you're using poles, especially, what happens is what you'd call cadence lock. It's a pretty common term among runners, especially, where the watch can mistake your heart rate for what your cadence is. And it's because of the movement of your arm that an optical heart rate, which is what any wrist-based wearable is actually sending lights down beneath your skin, and it's reflecting light back into the sensor. And that's how it measures the frequency of the pulse for your heart rate. And you could actually test, and anybody could sitting at home, if you sat and waved your arm frequently above your head really hard, you'd see that your heart rate is artificially inflating. Even though it's not, it's going to start tracking the total count. You can do back-end processing on algorithms to try and make all that better. But that's something that generally does happen. Now, how to alleviate that is exactly what you mentioned. It's wear it tighter, wear it a little bit higher above the wrist bone. There's usually just a little bit more substance the higher you get from like the wrist bone.
Up the
arm towards the elbow. Keeping your hands warm, especially in winter, because you have to also think that in winter, what your body's doing is it's not sending a ton of blood to the extremities. It's keeping your core warm. And so the colder your hands get, the less blood they're getting. So the less accurate a wrist-based watch is going to be. And then the other thing that is a limitation, again, across brands is that your wrist, generally speaking, is pretty far away from your heart. So there's also going to be a lag time in how it responds. Now, if you're doing something where you feel that you've increased intensity for 15 or 20 minutes, it should be spot on at that point. But if you've increased intensity for like 30 seconds, that's a very different conversation. And as you move a heart rate sensor closer to your heart, whether it's a chest strap or one that you wear on the upper arm, that gap actually makes a bigger difference than you might think. In addition, if it's worn on the upper arm, if it's an optical heart rate like the one that we have, again, just more substance. There's going to be less bones, less interference, really.
That's really interesting. So back to the lag time thing, on a wrist-based monitor, what's like the lag time, I guess, or like give me a range. You're saying 15 minutes to 30 seconds. That's a huge range, right?
Yeah.
So like, could there be a more pinpoint accuracy, like 3 minutes or 2 minutes or 1 minute?
Yeah, and I gave the 15-minute one, I think, as an example of just probably a overshot of expecting accuracy. But what you should expect is that if you're doing a really high intensity push for any reason, let's say you're going from a zone 1, you're hiking very easy, and you really increase the intensity, whether it's for a workout or just because something gets difficult. Let's say numbers wise, your actual heart rate goes from 120 or 130 to 160 or 70. It's probably going to take a watch anywhere from 15 to 30 seconds to build up to what the accurate number is. So there is a delay there. And that's why the shorter intervals, I always say, are more of a problem, because if you get down to a minute or a 2-minute interval, you're not necessarily missing, but you're not going to see it perfectly reflected, is probably a better way to put it, just with that lag time.
So would it be safe to say that a change in heart rate for 60 seconds, you're likely going to see most of that on the watch reflected? Okay.
Yep.
That's kind of good to know, because that's actually where I've had, maybe it's like running, say, hills or something like that. And I'm like, there's no way my heart rate's 120 right now, or something like that.
Yep.
Not really counting in for the fact that you're measuring something that's not super close to the body. How much more accurate do you think your armband is versus the wristwatch?
It's the armband is great. I love it. Before we had ours, I had a Polar Verity Sense, and I know a lot of people have an experience, especially if it's triathlon world, chest strap experience. But an upper arm optical, we didn't necessarily have any concrete data against like what's the accuracy from the wrist compared to the arm. But what we did do a lot of is like, what's the upper arm compared to a chest strap, which a chest strap is still the gold standard. The problems with the chest strap are that it's very uncomfortable, especially for long periods, to wear something around your entire torso, and that chest straps also struggle in cold weather. You have to have the sensors wet, basically. So like sweat helps, because chest straps are a different technology. They're an ECG rather than optical heart rate. But the arm-based one that we have for like running, hiking specifically, at any given moment for easy efforts, like just a casual day or even like a zone 2 workout, whatever you're doing, for running, hiking was about 98% accurate compared to a chest strap, which is awesome to see, because that's really the best you can get. When you get into other sports like cycling, there are some other problems. We still saw really good data, like 95, 96% accuracy. And as we continue to build out into more sports, we'll certainly put more focus on the algorithmic side of how to improve that for other sport profiles. But yeah, I share your sentiment. It's very much an easy product to use. It's comfortable. And if you do care about heart rate, it's very helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. You just get so many people there's lots of philosophies on there about, should you really care that much about your heart rate, vice versa, so on. So for our audience, I guess what I would just say is, hiking at altitude, if you're getting good heart rate monitor, like data back, the biggest things that you can look for is altitude sickness. I've used it like obviously you can do the pulse ox, which is super helpful. But also just if you're seeing your heart rate is just high and staying high, you can preemptively like realize, hey, I need to back off my effort, or I need to hydrate, because dehydration can lead to altitude sickness a lot. So you can use it as a precursor to help yourself not get sick at altitude, or to just know like, hey, I'm pushing a little too hard here. So I think there's some really valuable aspects of this, especially everyone that's in the OV 100 mile challenge right now. You guys are setting out and likely pushing more mileage than you've ever done on trail when you do this. And so having a tool in your toolbox that's monitoring your heart rate will allow you to know and dial back that pacing. And for something like this, if you're doing an all day 10-hour effort and you're not some super athlete, like you should be keeping your heart rate under, say, I don't know, 140 or something, right? You don't want to be stretching it out to like 160s and then realizing halfway through the day that you're, either getting altitude sickness or you're bonking, right? Which is where you're just completely out of energy, or your legs are blown up, so you can use some of this. I think it's really, really helpful whether you're hiking or running. And I've used it for me personally, where I actually started to really watch heart rate was I got altitude sickness, essentially a couple times, and I could go back and look at the data and be like, I laid down to go to sleep and I have a very low resting heart rate, and my heart rate was not going under like 85 beats per minute when I actually like drifted off for a little bit, woke back up, and my heart rate was still at like 85. And that's like a huge red flag. Now in that scenario, like you could see it after the fact, but you can also, it was kind of from that scenario that I started to watch it. When I was getting into a resting position, let's say you stop for lunch and you try to get your heart rate down. If your heart rate's not coming down, that's a good opportunity to just recognize, hey, something's not going right here. Maybe I need to dial back pace. Maybe I'm dehydrated because dehydration will elevate your heart rate. So lots of valuable information. And this kind of leads me into the next part of this, which is the daily benefits of a watch. So I started with the Garmin watch, and it has the body battery, right? I will say body battery it's a very digestible number that they give you, because you just look at it and it's one number and you're just like, all right, my body's here. And essentially it's a very generic term, because it's like, well, it's taking in like what you've been doing lately, heart rate variability, how well you sleep, supposedly. Like they're trying to like break it down into this one number. I find that it's helpful, but I've also got a lot of family members that use the Garmin watches, and I find that they'll ask me just crazy questions at times where it's like, my body battery says this, and that's just absurd, and stuff like that. And there is inaccuracy in it, right? For sure. Cause there's so many variables. Maybe the watch wasn't on very well through sleep. Maybe it's more accurate than you realize too. I've had people kind of say that, like, oh yeah, my body battery said it was super low, and then the next day I got sick. It was like almost like it could preemptively pick something. So with your guys' setup, you have, in some ways, I feel like it's a little bit less easily digestible for the average person, but it also has just a little bit more info, if that makes sense. So number one is what I tell people is like, if they want to know body battery, they're coming from a Garmin watch. I just say like, well, look at your heart rate variability, your overnight heart rate variability. And then just like, once you kind of know your numbers, which you guys will make those suggestions for you, like, all right, in fact, my mom was telling me what her heart rate variability was, and I like couldn't believe it. But then I looked it up, and for her age and demographic and stuff, I was like, that actually wasn't off my rocker. But for me, it would have been a crazy number. Yeah. Anyway, so I kind of use that as like the body battery of your guys' app, but would love to hear just your insights on how you can look at the info that you give and make some assumptions and make decisions and just know what's going on with your body.
Mm-hmm. So there's a handful of things. You mentioned, I think, all of them. The most equivalent thing, which we certainly will be building out to be more robust in the future, the very near future, is we do have a recovery score. And that recovery score right now, the biggest difference between Garmin and COROS is that ours does not currently include sleep or heart rate variability into the recovery score. So the recovery score is sheerly based off training, and it's only for recorded workouts. Now, we will include a lot more into that in the future. And with anything, just like what you were saying, if people think the body battery on Garmin or the recovery score on COROS is wrong or right, it's good data in, good data out, right? Was your heart rate, did it look accurate during the activity? Does it look like everything is normal for the inputs that are going into there? We also do have now what we call daily stress, which I find to be a pretty useful metric. It's on one of the latest updates that came out, and that's going to measure your heart rate variability and your heart rate during the day. So if, let's say, you get on a meeting or you have a stressful moment at work, and the indicators that would say you're more stressed are increased heart rate and actually decreased heart rate variability. So heart rate variability goes down as your nervous system ramps up effectively. It's kind of vice versa. So if you think about heart rate variability in that sense, it's going to be at in simple terms, and maybe you've talked about it before on your show, but it's quite literally the measurement between successive heartbeats. And so if your heart's beating 60 beats per minute, that's not necessarily once every second. It varies, and that's where you get the variance term. And so the more that it varies, the more that your body is saying, I'm in a relaxed state. The less that it varies, the less consistent it is basically your body saying, I am very alert. I'm ready to take on whatever we need to. But that's taxing. And so daily stress is another one that I find to be a really unique metric to look at throughout the day to just kind of provide you with what's my normal daily stress score. Did today seem more stressful, even though my actual workout that I did was very normal? So those would be, I think, the two things to keep an eye on that you didn't mention. And then for what you did, certainly sleep. What was your heart rate during sleep? That's a really useful metric, like you mentioned. Your heart rate variability overnight. And one thing we try to do very well with heart rate variability is we provide more of a frame of understanding for the terms. We try to not provide action items to do from it because it's such a complex topic, like you mentioned, right? Your heart rate variability can't be compared to another person's. They're individualized. Generally speaking, if you are, as you become more fit, more relaxed, your heart rate variability will increase over time, but it's very much an over time metric. It's really hard to say that one day is something that you should do anything because of or not do anything because of from an action point. There's a lot of nuances within heart rate variability, but the thing I will always say with both resting heart rate and heart rate variability overnight is that the trend data is always going to be more valuable than looking at any single day, especially in a world where if you look at a lot of data each day, it's really easy to get worked up about seeing one thing that doesn't seem like it's in alignment. But those would be the big things that on a day-to-day perspective I find to be pretty helpful.
Yeah. You said that as the nervous system gets taxed more, heart rate variability goes down. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay. So like the harder you work out and the more the more backpacking you do, the more miles you do, like you're putting stress on your nervous system. It's going to lower your heart rate variability, HRV. What drives it up?
So and I should specify, and maybe this is how you're explaining it too, but it's going to drive it down in the short term, meaning like at that moment, if I am sitting right now at my computer and I go for a run, my heart rate variability is going to drop significantly. But what these micro stressors of working out, right? Whether it's hiking, sitting in a sauna, doing anything like that, they're micro stressors that are basically preparing your body to be more adaptable. And those micro stressors will increase it over time. And that's kind of where you would see it in the overnight data. But there's a lot of things, and I think it's hyper individualized as to what makes it better. I mean, when I worked at Whoop and here as well, it's fun to hear some of the things that make some people's increase over time. It can be the things that I think everybody hears a lot of now. It can be a sauna. It can be doing an ice barrel in the morning. It can be all these more newer recovery methods. It can also be something like I've talked to a lot of people that they always say when they go home for holidays and they're surrounded by family, they're going to see their heart rate variability go up over time because they're just in a very relaxed state. Your body's just saying, oh, okay, we're decompressing for a bit. I'm not nervous about work. I'm not nervous about this other thing. We're fully relaxed. And that's usually going to be a sign that you see reflected by an increase in heart rate variability.
So the higher the heart rate variability, the better.
Yep.
Am I getting that?
Correct.
And you can adjust your own levels of that by being more fit or active or recovery or
Yep.
things like that. Like your normal range per se could start to drift upwards on a scale.
Totally.
Okay. That's super valuable. I like the stress metric. I like looking at some of these, resting heart rates. I do like to look at the recovery score and the training status. I think there's some real value in that. So your sleep metrics, you don't give a score, right? Garmin gives this is your sleep score, right? So how do you interpret the sleep data?
The first thing I will say, and kind of goes back to the point that I was making early, is that if it's something that we see value in, it's not that we're not doing it because we don't want to, as much as it's a priority system. We will have a sleep score very soon. But even with a sleep score, I do think it's valuable to be able to try and interpret it on your own.
Right.
And with sleep, as it is right now, I think it depends on your use case. The thing I look at most is going to be what was my resting heart rate overnight. I know that when I go up higher at altitude, I'm in Colorado. So if I go to Leadville or if I go to Ouray or Telluride, generally I'm going to expect to see a few beats per minute increase in my sleep. That happens at altitude. Your body's working a little bit harder to get oxygen. The other things in sleep that are really helpful to look at are just your actual time spent in specific cycles, where deep sleep and REM sleep are going to be the more restorative cycles. So the more time that you spend in those cycles, generally the higher quality of sleep that you got that night, or the more restored you should feel in the morning.
Yeah. I think I'm no expert on this, but usually the number one thing I look for is deep sleep, just how much time I got to deep sleep, and then kind of the amount of cycles you're getting into that deep sleep. So I definitely find value in that. And that, going back to the resting heart rate, same thing. I pay attention to that drastically at altitude. For my own personal references, so my overnight heart rate is 40, 41. That's my lowest, right? When I go to altitude, usually night one, I'm in the low 60s. And then but it'll never really get below say 55 or between 50 and 55. So that's kind of that's another metric I use to know if I'm adapting to altitude, or if maybe I'm not adapting well enough and I need to, focus on maybe hydrating better or something like that. So it is super valuable, but I think this is a great place to just point out a few things and kind of wrap this up just a little bit. I love what you guys are doing. You guys got into the game only 6 years ago, which in all reality is not that long ago. When you're talking about software and building layers of software, and then you've got the hardware components, and there's so much going on, and then being able to bring that all into a super, usable interface. So knowing that you guys have only been around 6 years tells me a lot. It also tells me a lot about where you're going, meaning just like you said, you're constantly building in this, you're improving this. And I think there's so much value in seeing that, because it basically just tells me that I will continue to expect big things out of COROS, and I expect the app to just continue to improve and become a little bit more user-friendly for basic level users, as well as these advanced level users that are just, professional athletes. I love that you guys really, are, I would say, more niche focused, meaning you are focused on you guys, I know you're talking about expanding into other areas, but at the same time, I think there's a lot of value of where you've started and where you've dialed this in right now. And I would say also, what I typically will tell people is, I feel like so far, knock on wood, that this stays the same. Dollar for dollar, you just get more out of spending money on the COROS. Your guys' what you get, the hardware itself, right? It feels to me like if I was to try to match the Apex 2 Pro with a Garmin equivalent, I'm going to spend hundreds more. Is kind of, so when people are asking, it's lately I've had a little harder of a time recommending the Garmin products, specific if you want something that can do everything the Apex 2 can do, because I'm you're just going to spend so much more, is how I kind of feel about it. But I've personally seen the app get a little bit better even in the year that I've been using the COROS. I think user interfaces continue to improve. So I think you guys are really on the right track. I'm glad to hear you're continuing to push on some of these things that will make it, continue to make the user interface a little bit better for, like I say, not the crazy dialed in, professional athletes that want to like know everything about HRV and know everything about, some of these indicators. But, I think overall, I guess I would just say that I think that you guys are crushing it in so many ways, and I think you're not the up and comers anymore, but you guys are still like, I think you're just gonna dominate this space. Like because you guys are so focused on just this wearable, like for the most part, just these wearables too. Like you look at some of these bigger companies, they got their hands in 50 million things. It makes it so hard to be the best at one thing when you've got your hands in 50 million things. And so, I think you guys are crushing it, and really appreciate you coming on and just sharing some of these deeper insights, how people can get more out of this watch, your app. And I mean, I obviously learned some things for myself, and I think that whether you're backpacking, training, living your daily life, there is some serious value to tracking your health, tracking your mileage, and and everything in between. So with that, Darian, what did we miss? Anything that you wanted to touch on that we missed, or anything else that you just, I don't know, want to put in here, I guess, at this point?
No, I think you covered it. That I very much appreciate the last bit there. It's very good to hear. It's fun to be at a smaller company that is, we do feel like we're building something in a way that we can be nimble and we can provide a solution that maybe isn't getting enough or as much focus from other companies in the space. And so, yeah, we do our best. We really want to make sure that we are focused on the user. And that's when I talk about continuing to update products, add more value, how we think about it. It's a really big focus of ours. But I think the last note I just leave it with is best of luck in your race coming up. It's exciting.
I will absolutely need it. This is my first 100 miler. I'll say the typical ultra marathon thing. It'll probably be my last, and then 2 days later it won't be. But I'll need all of the luck. I'm not your typical runner build, right? I'm like a little bit bigger of a dude, and so these are hard efforts for sure. But training has been good. So hopefully coming in healthy, and we'll see, man. It's fun though. It's exciting, whether it's backpacking, running, whatever. I think just setting big goals like this and pushing yourself is a ton of fun. So I appreciate it.
Of course, not a problem. And thank you again for having me on. I enjoyed it.
Yeah. Thank you for coming on. If you're interested in a COROS watch, you can find that inside the Live Ultralight membership, or you can jump over to coros.com, check those guys out. Well worth following them. You'll see what feels like every professional athlete these days is running their watches and sponsored by them. So just absolutely crushing it. There's no shortage of finding these guys and learning more about their products. So thanks again for coming on.
Yep. Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right. I hope you guys really enjoyed that episode with Darian from COROS. I know that I loved it. I learned a bunch of stuff that I'm going to be instantly applying to using my watch in this upcoming race, the Bryce Canyon 100. I wanted to call out yet again that during the month of May, you guys can save additional money on COROS watches, as well as on other retail products such as our favorite water filters, cooking supplies, food, a whole bunch of stuff that we offer inside of the closed area of the membership. Now, again, membership's $10 a month, but it is just loading store credit at $10 into your account. So you're just loading money into a savings account. And we try to make sure that you will always have stuff to spend money on, whether it's retail or whether it's Outdoor Vitals products. So go join the membership and save on a COROS watch this month. Okay. Really appreciative of Darian coming on and you guys listening to this. Make sure you guys are subscribed. If you enjoyed this podcast, let us know. Leave us a review or share this. That always is helpful. And we'll catch you guys in a future episode.